want you to imagine this scenario for a moment. You're camping. You're by the fire. It's late at night. The crickets are chirping. The frogs have even gone to sleep. The fire is starting to dim. You're getting sleepy. Your eyes are drowsy. You get the blanket. You're ready to just kind of curl up by the log and enjoy a few more moments by the fire. It's very serene, very calm, very soothing. You utter a quiet prayer that God would watch over you and that you would just enjoy the rest of the night. The stars are in the sky. You're looking up. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, whack! This figure comes jumping out of the bushes, grabs you by the neck, twirls you to the ground, tosses around, grabs your arm. You fight back. You're like trying to break free. They grab your leg, and back and forth. There's this wrestling match that continues for like hours. You're bruised. Your hair is full of sweat and caked up dirt. You got a couple little scratches on the elbows and arms. You're just exhausted. Your muscles feel like they're on fire because you've been grappling and wrestling with this creature, this person, for like hours now. Your lungs are like almost filled, burning because you've been breathing so heavily, and you hold on and you lock in, and then you got to take a breath in order to just move a little bit more. And you're thinking to yourself the whole time, I'm not going to let this wrestling match go to waste. I want to get blessed in all this in some way, shape, or form. I didn't go through this for 4 hours or 5 hours or whatever it is, only to just have my opponent walk away. Well, that's exactly what happened with Jacob. It's nighttime. He's ready to go to sleep. And out of nowhere, a wrestling match with the angel of the Lord commences. And Jacob refuses to let go. He asks the angel to bless him before he's willing to release him. And the angel touches his hip, his socket. There's a sear of pain that goes flashing through. He's now going to limp the rest of his life. The angel agrees to bless Jacob, but he also says to him, I'm going to call you something different. Your name is about to change. It's no longer going to be referred to as Jacob, but as Israel. Literally in Hebrew, the word Israel means to contend with, to struggle with, to grapple with, and to prevail. And that was Jacob's life. And that was the life that we see for the nation of Israel. In this constant wrestling match, this grappling, this struggle for survival, the entire history of a nation was demarked by this struggle that ensues. And that's exactly what Jesus addresses as followers of his kingdom, as members of the kingdom, as disciples of his. We will go to the mat. We will be wrestling. And he brings it up in the parable study to display to us and to explain to us and to help us realize that there is going to be a struggle in life. And that struggle has good and there's blessing. But he unpacks it and unfolds it for us in Matthew chapter 13, picking up in verse 24. Let's take a peek. Jesus presented another parable to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went away. But when the wheat sprouted and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. The slaves of the landowner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? And he said to them, An enemy has done this. The slave said to him, Do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, No. For while you're gathering up the tares, you may uproot the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, First gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. That's the first part. The second part of this, Jesus goes on to explain. Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples came to him and said, "Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field." And he said, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom, and the tares are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. So just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous shall shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." We'll stop right there. What we have here is really a proclamation, an explanation, and then some application. 3 parts to our message this morning. Jesus is teaching about the kingdom, and we've been studying this concept, this topic of kingdom living, a relationship whereby God rules as Lord over our lives. And he unpacks this and unfolds it and presents it in all sorts of slices and angles throughout the entire corpus of his teaching in the Gospels. And that's what we've been looking at. What we find here is he moves on to this parable of what we call the wheat and the weeds. Tares are another word for weed in it's a more archaic term. But what we find here is that we have this sowing of wheat in a field, a very common agricultural picture that everyone in Palestine was familiar with. They had wheat growing all over the place. And they find here that there is also these weeds. And I wanted to give you a picture here of the difference. The weed and the wheat, you're looking at a little bit of both. In ancient times, as you're looking at the screen on the left, that's wheat. On the right is darnel. And darnel is a weed that was often planted among wheat by enemies. It looks almost identical to the wheat. In fact, unless you have a trained eye and you know what to look for, you can't tell the difference until the harvest. When harvest rolls around, the wheat begins to turn a nice golden brown, and the darnel turns like a grayish, sickly color. It bears a seed, but it's not like wheat where you can eat it. In fact, if you were to eat the produce from darnel, it would make you sick. It's got a noxious, poisonous, quasi narcotic type of an effect where you'd feel sleepy and you'd get sick on this stuff. And this is what Jesus is talking about here. This is what was understood by his original audience. This is what's happening. And the servants are in a predicament. They bring this up. They realize that something is going on here. They had recognized something was amiss in the field, and they ask the owner about the predicament. And the owner responds, notice here, that this isn't just a natural occurrence. I go out to my garden and I see weeds all the time. And I don't sit there and say, "Oh man, my neighbor did this." I don't blame people. I don't sit there and think to, maybe somebody down the street or somebody who's got an axe to grind with me, decided to get back at me and throw dandelions all over my garden, because they just grow. And you have them too. And this is not something that we normally would associate with an enemy, because weeds just naturally pop up anywhere. And you let your garden go for like more than 15 minutes and they're going to start to grow. So it's just, they're a menace, they're there, and it's a problem. But in ancient times, this was actually something that people would do to one another. They would intentionally find a newly plowed field that had been sown, and they would run around and they would scatter weeds. And this would create an economic hardship. Think about it for a moment. Imagine your income is coming out of that 4 acres in the back, and you're growing barley or wheat or something like that, and somebody comes by and they want to get at you. They want to weaken you. They want to hurt you in some capacity. And they start throwing this darnel out there, and you can't tell the difference, and it all grows up together, and your harvest now could be diminished by 10, 20, 30, 40%. Why? Because this stuff chokes it out. It makes it difficult for the wheat to grow. It has to struggle to survive because it has all these competitive plants in the soil vying for the nutrients, vying for the water, vying for the sunlight. And because of that, it inflicts economic hardship. In India, to this day, to sow weeds in a neighbor's field is considered illegal. It's a practice that does occur continually, or has continued since the biblical era. The Romans would actually consider this a punishable crime. I mean, you could spend time in the slammer if you were caught sowing darnel or any form of weed in a neighbor's field. It was that serious. But what we find here, and this is where Jesus throws a total monkey wrench into the story. When the servants come and say, hey, let's try to weed this out, let's try to make the harvest as fruitful as possible, the owner says no. You're not going to pull anything up. This is kind of a shocking thing. Weeding is something that happened not only in the fields, where you would sow your gardens and your crops. Believe it or not, shepherds would weed. When a shepherd was going to bring their sheep to a new pasture, they would often go ahead, survey the situation, and look for any plants that were toxic to the sheep, and they'd run around and they'd pull them all out. So they were familiar with dealing with this type of a problem. But Jesus puts the kibosh on it just the same. He moves on here to the explanation. The disciples are a little confused, and he wants them to understand what he is attempting to convey. He explains, first off, the sower, the first sower, is himself. It's the Son of Man. It's Jesus. The seed, here we find, are believers, and the field is the world. He also goes on to explain that the sower of the tares, the darnel, the weeds, is the enemy, and these are his followers. The key here is going to be the harvest at the end of the age. And this dovetails with a passage in Malachi. Right at the end of the Bible, the Old Testament, we find that there's a complaint being made in the book of Malachi. Those who are righteous, those who are following after God, are complaining before the Lord, saying, it's futile to follow the Lord because what good does it do us? And God says, hey, and this is Dave's vernacular, just take a step back and chill. The day will come when you will see the difference between the righteous and the unrighteous, and you will shine forth like the noonday sun. So this idea of struggling with this conglomeration of good and evil, righteous and unrighteous, those who are following after God and those who are wicked, is an ongoing motif that we see in the Bible. In fact, it was an ongoing problem in the first century. And there was a struggle that took place here, so much so that in ancient times you had groups of people that wanted to separate and live different lives apart from society. When John the Baptist comes on the scene, we learn that he comes from a sect called the Essenes. There was a group of Jews during the first century who were so fed up with the weeds of the world, so fed up with the toxic people around them, so fed up with the Romans and all of the influence of Greco society, that they actually pulled back and lived in the desert as separatists. And they had these little communes and communities out in the middle of the boonies where they lived together to follow after God. They pulled themselves back. We find in the early church a similar trend occurs. The monatists, that's where we get the idea of a monastery or people that live these cloistered lives. That started around the 2nd century. Again, people were just fed up with the world. They're fed up with the Romans. They're fed up with the persecution. They're fed up with the problems of life. They're fed up with the weeds of the world once again. And what do? They pull back into the desert and they live these separate lives. That mentality has permeated even today. I call them bubble wrap Christians. We want to just pull back and be so separate from everything in the world because we're just so fed up with the world, so fed up with the struggle, so fed up with the persecution, so fed up with the pressure, so fed up with the fact that there's just so much immorality going on and it just rubs off on us over and over and over again. But the Bible tells us we're called to be in the world, but what? Not of the world. We're supposed to go out into the world and be an influence. And this is what Jesus is getting at here. That the life of a kingdom follower is going to be a life of struggle in a world that stands in diametric opposition to the gospel, but we're called to live in that world just the same. There's going to be a struggle. And that's what brings us really to our 2 points of application today. There's a negative and a positive. The negative one is this, what not to do. Do not judge. I want to say that again. In fact, I'm going to pull it up as a passage here. Jesus said it in Matthew, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged." I cannot emphasize this point enough. And here's why. We don't know who's going to be wheat. When these plants grow, they look the same. It's almost impossible to distinguish. We live in a world filled with people, and we think to ourselves, there is no way that person's going to come into the kingdom. That's a weed. And it turns out they end up getting saved anyway. I want you to think about the Apostle Paul. If there was ever a weed, a thorn in the side of the church, that guy went out and he had people killed. He had people imprisoned. Men, women, children, even their golden retrievers were going off to jail. He was confiscating jobs, homes, property. He was a royal pain in the side of the early church. No one would have thought in a million years that he would be the man who would pen half the New Testament. He got wheat there, but nobody saw it. And I think there's a lot of us in this room who led very weedy lives before we came to Jesus Christ. And you just don't know. We're not to judge. Because hearts change. God works. He moves. And transformation ensues in ways that go beyond anything we could ever see. So I believe our first level of application as we think about kingdom living is to be very careful not to be judgmental of the people around us and write them off and say, forget about that one. They're beyond repair. No. No one is beyond repair with the God. I met this woman a few years back, many years back now I'm going. She went to this church service. There's this big church, and they got one of these high-octane preachers. And he came in there. He was just going full guns with the gospel. Dozens of people every night were coming forward and getting saved, accepting Christ, seeing their need and repenting. It was a huge impact on this church. It was a mega, a couple thousand people were there, and lots of good things were happening. This woman was sitting in the back the whole time. The last night, he gives his invitation. People are coming forward. She gets up out of her seat, and she storms out the back of the church. Everybody wrote her off. Oh my gosh, she just left. Right? This is the highlight of the night. This is when she needs to get saved, and what's going on? And she beats feet out of there. They never saw her again. What they didn't see was the fact that she ran down the steps of the church into the ladies' room. She was so convicted and so distraught and so overwhelmed with her need for Christ and so embarrassed over the fact that she was crying so much in her pew that she ran down into the restroom, closed the door, locked it, put something in the way, a trash basket, and cried out and accepted Christ. And then she went home. 6 months later, she got baptized, and she was growing in her faith, and nobody ever saw it. All they saw was somebody that looked like they were really upset and bolting out of the back of the door. We don't know. We don't see the heart. We don't fully understand the work of God. And we won't until it's complete. That's the first application. The second is struggling helps us grow. Struggling helps us to grow. When we're under pressure, that is when God facilitates internal heart change, soul change, mind change, and growth. When we grapple, we grow. We grow in appreciation. I want you to think about your first paycheck. Whenever you got, for me, I was like 11 or something like that. I remember going out and working like crazy. I worked at a farm And the only place you can get a job when I was growing up was at the local farm, and it was under the table. You got paid cash. It was like $3 an hour to throw hay. And I'll never, I was out there in the fields, heaving bales, all summer long. And I remember coming back, I had like $20, and I'm like, whoa, and all of a sudden, the value of money just skyrocketed. I'm thinking to myself, man, I had to work like an entire afternoon to make this $20. I'm going to make it last, And suddenly there's this level of appreciation that seems to flood when you have to go out there and struggle to make a few dollars. Struggling enables us to grow in appreciation. As we wrestle through life, we come to the realization that this is exactly what Jesus went through for us. That sense of appreciation for his rejection. That sense of appreciation for the pain. That sense of appreciation for the loneliness that he endured for you and for me begins to grow. It also begins to produce in us this struggle. It puts us in a place where we want to seek deeper. We want to build. When you're under pressure, especially if somebody, a weedy person in life comes by and starts to challenge you, you come to a crossroads, and it will either push you deeper into your relationship with God, or you're going to run out the door. I know a young man years back. He accepts Christ. He was like a teenager. He had no Christian friends, except this one dude. And all the people around him were unbelievers. And they kept on prodding him and challenging him and asking him all sorts of crazy questions. And he didn't know any answers. He didn't know what to do. But what he would do is every time he had some crazy question tossed at him, every time he got persecuted, every time he got ostracized a little bit, he'd go back into his Bible and start reading. He started buying books on apologetics. He started reading the patristics. He started really digging into church history and theology and the Word. He grew because of that pressure he was under, because he was living in a weedy world. And that's what happens with us as well. When we're under pressure, it forces us to ask the question, Lord, where are you? How are you functioning? How do I fix this problem? What does your word have to say about conflict resolution in the workplace? Those weeds help us in that struggle to build and grow deeper. It also enables us to cultivate compassion. I want to bring you to a passage here in 2 Corinthians. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. In other words, when we go through tough times, especially tough interpersonal times, something changes within the human soul. We develop compassion. Compassion, by definition, is the ability to connect with someone else's pain and hardship. Some of you in this room understand rejection because you've been rejected. You understand abandonment. You understand ostracism. You understand what it's like to be the only one in the room who is following Christ. And you can connect with another person on a level that you couldn't before you went through that experience. The struggle, the weeds of this world, those noxious, toxic people rubbing on us the wrong way, help us to understand what it's like to be human and how to bridge into other people's lives. Some of you have lost homes to fires. Some of you have lost loved ones. Some of you have been through catastrophic illnesses. And those tragedies, those traumas, will either harden the human heart, or they will create in us a level of empathy and a level of compassion and a level of concern that was not there before. We grow through that struggle. And Jesus is identifying it here. The fourth area of growth encompasses what Caleb shared with us before. I wanted to read for you 2 of those verses. For we do not want you to be unaware, brethren, of our affliction, which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened excessively beyond our strength, so that we despised even of life. Indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves, so that we would what? Now here's the result. I want you to hang on to this very last section of the verse. What does that struggle produce? Faith. We break out of self-dependency and we morph into trusting in God. The Apostle Paul had to go through this. Now, if Paul had to go through it, you can bet your bottom dollar we're going to be facing similar trials. Hardship forces us to trust. It forces us out of our own box, out of our own resources, out of our own comfort zone, and into the arms of a God who wants to walk with us through the fire and the flood and the water. And this is where we find faith is established, it's refined, it grows, it is stretched. It is when we face opposition. That struggle is part of kingdom living. And it brings us to that place of being more and more dependent upon Christ. I'm going to give you one final picture of what this looks like, and then we'll wrap it up. When I was in 7th grade, we had this couple that taught, this husband and wife, math and language arts, Mr. and Mrs. Hooray. And that's really their name. I'm not just making it up. But now, I was not the stellar student. In fact, I hated everything but lunch. So just being in school was a struggle, especially math, because once I was out of fingers and toes, I was a helpless mess. But Mr. Hooray, the math teacher, he was an okay guy. I mean, even I got along with him a little bit. But his wife was the nastiest thing on the planet. I mean, we swore she rode a broom into church, or in the school. I mean, you go into the classroom and she'd be like, put your shoes over there, you're bringing mud into my room. And she would start, she was half cocked before she even walked through the door. I mean, she'd be yelling at teachers, she'd be yelling at the principal. I mean, she yelled at everybody. And I was on the top of the list. And, and it was always like getting detentions constantly, because you walk in the room, oh, you got to clean up the blackboard. You didn't do it, you're in detention. I mean, I spent like half my life in detention in 7th grade. And she was always snapping at people, getting nasty. She had these lists of things you had to do the minute you walked through the door, lists before you left. Half of us missed the bus to go home because we were so busy with our after-school chores, because she wanted the room spotless, and there was no way in Hades she was letting anybody out that door unless you could eat off the blackboard. I mean, it was just that, she was just that strict. I couldn't stand her. And what made it worse was the one subject that I sort of tilted in the direction of, and I liked a little bit, was language arts, because I liked to read. I hated it. I could not wait to get out of 7th grade. When I left that classroom, I was like, good riddance, I am out of here, done. And I was, so I thought. 10 years later, I get saved, all right? I just graduate college, I accept Christ as my Savior, realize my need for Jesus, making my profession of faith in Him, and I'm following after Him, and I'm about a year into being a brand new believer, and I got this buddy of mine. He has this moving company, this little side gig that he's running, and he calls me up. He's like, "Hey, Dave, I got a quick job over the weekend. It'll only take you an hour. We got to move a piano, and all the guys on my crew are going to be away for the weekend. Would you just mind giving me a hand here? I'll give you $100 cash. If you just come on down, there's a storage facility in the nearby town. We got to pick up this piano, and we got to bring it over to this condominium. It's only like 2 or 3 miles away, and just drop it off." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, sure. Saturday morning, $100 cash, 1 hour, I'm there." I mean, so I show up, and we get the piano loaded on the back of this little truck, and he's like, and I close the door, and we're starting to go off to this condo, and he's like, "You probably know the person we're going to bring this piano to." And I'm like, "Oh, do I?" And he's like, yeah. She was a language arts teacher at your school. You must have had Mrs. Hooray. I'm like, "No, I'm like, dude, this is trouble. I'm like, maybe we'll just leave the piano on the sidewalk or something like that and take off. I wanted nothing to do with this delivery. And I'm like, you don't know how nasty she was. And I start sharing all my sob stories and all the times she put me in detention and threatened to cut off my hand. And she was just horrible. And he's like, no, she's a different lady. And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's Broomhilda. You can't be, you got to be nuts. And no, she goes to my church. That's how I got this job. I'm like, she goes to church? You got to be kidding me. I want to know what church she was going to, And he said, no. She got baptized back in Easter, and she shared her testimony. She's a different lady. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, no. She shared with us on Easter Sunday what she went through, probably around the time you had her as a teacher. She got married, and not long after that, she was driving the car with her husband in it, and she got in a really bad accident. In fact, she was almost killed. And because of the accident, she was so badly injured, she wasn't able to have children. And her husband was really upset about it all. In fact, he was so upset that he began to have affairs with some of the teachers in the school. They fought for years. She tried to put the marriage back together. But he just walked out on her. Left her, and he ended up dying. She would come to school an absolute disaster because she was so distraught over the trauma she had been through and losing her husband like this. But she's a different lady, So we get there, and we unload the piano. And I'm like, ooh, what are we up for? We get the piano into the condo, and she's got lemonade waiting for us, fresh squeezed, and homemade cookies. She was really nice. And I'm like, man, I wish you were like this when I was in 7th grade, And she looks and she's like, yeah, you probably remember me. And I said, oh, I remember you. And she's like, God really got a hold of my life. And it's never been the same since. I came to trust Christ a few years probably after you had me. And I want you to know, I was going through a rough spell. And I'm really kind of sorry for the way I treated all my students. But because of Christ, I have a new outlook, a new life. I've got ministries that He has opened up doors for me to share with people who have lost kids, who've been the victim of affairs. I've been working with all sorts of folk who have been down a similar road that I've been. And it's really wonderful to see how God takes the messes of our life and puts them back together again and sends us out on ministry. And I got in the truck and I'm like, God is good. This entire life that I thought was toxic, weeds, tares, horrible, was completely turned around. This lady was serving Christ and witnessing for Him and involved with all sorts of women's ministries. It was absolutely beautiful what God was doing through her struggle, through her tragedy, through her trials and tribulations. And I look at that and I think to myself, kingdom living involves a wrestling match. It's Jacob's story over and over and over again in your life and in mine. And we grow through the grappling. And that's my hope and prayer for us as a church. As we limp along life, as we struggle with those noxious people, as we deal with circumstances that seem to be tearing us apart, it's in the midst of that struggle that we grow. Let's pray.